Just as it was with The Last Jedi in 2017 and Game of Thrones Season 8 in 2019, The Last of Us Part 2 quickly became one of the most polarizing pieces of media of 2020. There are several factors among the 20+ hour game that contributed to this reaction from general audiences. And as is the case with several pieces of media that are met with mixed reactions, there is quite a bit of cognitive dissonance among critics of the game. In this video, I want to explore the mechanics of two particular criticisms about The Last of Us Part 2, compare and contrast the qualities of these elements to relevant pieces of media, and directly address poorly presented argumentation about said criticisms. The 2 points I'd like to discuss are the execution of Joel's death and Ellie's decision to spare Abby's life at the end of the game. Let's start with Joel. The inciting incident of the game occurs when a newly introduced character named Abby runs into Joel and Tommy whilst being pursued by a group of infected. Upon learning their names, Abby offers them refuge at a mansion where her friends are. The three of them arrive and Abby's team kills the pursuing infected. When Tommy and Joel make it inside the house, the two of them explain that they live near the mansion and reintroduce themselves to Abby's friends. After Joel realizes that the group seems familiar with them, Abby cripples Joel with a shotgun blast to the leg while Abby's group knocks Tommy unconscious. Abby then proceeds to torture Joel by beating him with a golf club. When Ellie arrives at the mansion, the group pin her down and Abby delivers the killing blow to Joel whilst Ellie begs for her to spare his life.
Joel, get up. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't shoot. Joel, please get up. No!
For obvious reasons, this scene resulted in widespread backlash from fans of the first game, particularly after this plot detail was leaked prior to the game's release. Many who had expressed early interest in the game stated that Joel's death was the key reason they didn't want to play the game. What I first want to address is the straw man argument against criticisms of this scene. Several critics who have defended this game have propagated that people dislike this scene based on the simple nature that Joel dies with no other factors being considered. If a character's death upsets a player to the degree that they have no interest in playing a game or do not believe they can get immersed in it, then that is an entirely fair reaction. However, in a vacuum, the concept of a character dying is not an inherent criticism. Main characters dying in stories has been a staple of storytelling since their inception. When people levy arguments against character deaths, they are likely referring to the story mechanics of said death rather than the event in isolation. So how well constructed is Joel's death in terms of framing in the story as well as execution? Well, firstly, in regards to framing, this death is not one where the character in question goes out in the blaze of glory. Oftentimes when characters are killed, it's for the purpose of saving friends or loved ones that the character is attached to. This can lead to death scenes that are typically shared with said loved ones and show immense respect for the journey of the character and their sacrifice. But in the case of Joel, his death is both unceremonious and brutal. While this isn't an issue in and of itself, it is something that can leave a bad impression on an audience. Giving a character a respectful send-off will often satisfy an audience regardless of if the events leading to the death were well fleshed out, or if they rely on a weak or nonsensical narrative in order to function. When a character is killed suddenly or early in a story, as is the case with Joel, it tends to result in drastic changes to the plot or pacing of the narrative. And since these kinds of deaths tend to be done for the purpose of creating shock value, there are varying degrees of success in terms of execution. Some stories provide consistent and well-developed reasoning for why the characters are placed into a situation where they were brutally murdered, resulting in moments that are both shocking and narratively powerful. Some stories use the deaths of characters as a means to bolster alternative elements of the story or characters and to leave the audience on an emotionally provocative note. And some stories kill characters primarily as a means to rush towards a particular payoff without sufficient setup, resulting in nonsensical plot progression and the humiliation of the character in question. In order to judge the efficacy of these unceremonious conclusions for characters, we examine the actions of the characters and events that resulted in the situation in question. Were these events informed by consistent progression in the choices of the characters, and did the events which led to the death of the character in question make sense? For an example of an unceremonious death servicing a foundational story payoff, let's look at Breaking Bad. The death of Hank Schrader in the episode Ozymandias is often cited as one of the greatest moments in the entire series. While there are several moments in the show where Walt was placed into a seemingly inescapable situation, this was truly the point of no return and what resulted in Walt losing both his money and his family. While this scene in isolation is well directed and shocking to watch, it's the events which led to it that make it so powerful. Throughout the series, Walt had been cooking meth and earning millions of dollars supposedly for his family in the event that he were to die of lung cancer. At the same time, Hank had been searching for an elusive and mysterious meth kingpin named Heisenberg. Only Hank is ignorant to the fact that the man he is looking for is in fact his own brother-in-law. This all changes, however, when Hank reads Walt's copy of Leaves of Grass and finds a note from Gail Bedecker. This connects the dots in Hank's mind and reveals to him that Walt is Heisenberg. Following this, Hank sets out to catch Walt before he can die of his recently returned cancer. With the help of Jesse, Hank manipulates Saul's bodyguard Huel and learns that Walt's money is in barrels and that he likely buried it in the desert. Using a fake picture and Jesse as cover, Hank gets Walt to confess and lead him to the money. Unsure about who may be arriving with Jesse, Walt calls Jack to serve as backup and get him out of the situation. However, upon realizing that Jesse is working with Hank, Walt calls Jack off. After arresting Walt and reading him his rights, Jack's crew arrives based on the coordinates that Walt supplied them with, resulting in a shootout between Hank and Jack's crew. Ozymandias opens with Steve Gomez dead and Hank wounded. Jack confronts Hank, and when Kenny reveals that he is a DEA agent, Jack prepares to execute him. This leads to Walt desperately begging for Hank's life and using everything from him being family to all his money. But in spite of Walt's efforts, Jack kills Hank with a bullet to the head.
Do what you're gonna do.
So how does this moment hold up in terms of development and execution? The cold conflict between Hank and Walt was something that was established as early as the first season of the series. Throughout the show, Walt had manipulated Hank at several turns in the hopes of hiding the truth from him. The inciting incident for Hank and Walt's direct conflict comes from the discovery of the Walt Whitman book, something that Walt kept as a token of pride for his past achievements working with Gus. This is something which is very much in line with Walt's character. Once Walt and Hank both came to understand the truth and their direct conflict was established, they both attempted to win in their separate goals. The discovery of the evidence that could convict Walt was supplied to Hank by Jesse, and Jesse's decision to help Hank is informed by a sense of self-loathing that he developed, as well as the revelation that Walt was responsible for poisoning Brock. Jesse's connection to Brock, as well as his general soft spot for kids, was something that was reinforced by the narrative on several occasions. Walt's instinct to listen to Jesse is the result of his investment in his money due to the direct connection that it holds to Walt's meth empire, and Walt's decision to call Jack is fueled by a sense of protection for his past achievements. When Jack arrives, all the cards are on the table. All that Walt has left is to desperately beg and offer his life's work to save Hank. But while Walt denies the situation, Hank accepts his fate, understanding that there is nothing that can be done. At the point of realization for all the characters involved in the scene, Jack finishes the deed. In regards to character consistency and plot progression, this scene is executed to absolute perfection. It pays off in a manner which is shocking in execution and layered in regards to succession of storytelling. On the flip side, you have a film like The Dark Knight Rises, a story where the protagonist falls into the trap of the lead antagonist and is defeated in combat. While this particular payoff is something which is shocking in isolation, it is the events which led to this moment that affect its efficacy. Bane's plan involving the manipulation of the stock market relies on nonsensical technology and his knowledge about the existence of resources that he could not possibly have been made aware of. And his plan to break the Bat after robbing him of his wealth relies on Bruce believing that he could single-handedly take on an army. Bruce falling into this trap is the only possible outcome that could come from attempting to storm the sewers with only himself and Catwoman, and it goes against everything that the audience has come to understand about Bruce's training in stealth, combat, and strategy. While not a death, Bruce being incapacitated narratively functions very similarly to a character death. It provides the antagonist of the film with greater power, leading to a low point for several of the supporting characters, and it's what builds to the return of the protagonist in the third act and the antagonist's plan being thwarted. Unfortunately, the groundwork that this scene is built on relies on nonsensical plot points in order to function. And the payoff, like all the payoffs in The Dark Knight Rises, relies on a broken setup and results in a hollow conclusion. Where's the trigger? Scenes like the two I have mentioned involve characters being trapped in a situation and ultimately defeated in some way by their own actions. Typically, this is the result of a character flaw or a detail in the world which they failed to perceive. In these sequences, the writers are essentially placing the character in question into checkmate. And as is the case with a game of chess, the players involved can follow the rules, resulting in a strategic and fair game, or they can cheat the rules, resulting in a lack of structural coherency and the investment of the players being cheated. So jumping back to The Last of Us Part 2, what plot points and actions of characters resulted in Joel's death? The first significant point is Abby running into Joel and Tommy. Later in the game, we learn that Abby received information from an outside source that Tommy was in Jackson, causing her to believe that Joel was also there. In addition to this, Tommy and Joel are part of the patrols in Jackson, and it makes sense that they would be on patrol during the day. But while these aspects of cause and effect put Abby in proximity to Joel, the method which brings them together is where the first of many contrivances originate. A horde of infected appear seemingly out of nowhere and force Abby as well as Tommy and Joel to become cornered in the same location. Contrived, but not beyond the realm of plausibility. Plenty of stories rely on a bit of good or bad luck in order to kickstart the plot, and it's all a part of a story's inciting incident. Following this, however, Tommy gives Abby his name as well as Joel's name willingly, providing Abby with confirmation that she found the man she was looking for. The infected then swarm in a way which forces them to return to Abby's stronghold rather than Jackson. And finally, Tommy and Joel offer their names willingly to Abby and her crew and are completely off guard to the point that Abby shoots Joel.
Don't act like you heard of us or something.
These two elements leading to Joel's death are where the consistency begins to fall apart. In the first game, it is very much established that Joel is a hardened man who has survived for 20 years in this world because he is always on guard. We see this from his introductory scene on Outbreak Day when he drives past a family on the road for the benefit of his family rather than to risk his life for them.
Let's see what they need. What do you think you're doing? Keep driving. I got a kid, Joel. So do we.
But we have room.
Keep driving, Tommy.
No!
I see what I see. Someone else will come along.
You should have helped him.
The death of Joel's daughter Sarah is a result of Joel trusting an authority figure and ultimately failing someone close to him. Joel's distrust of strangers is something that would be exacerbated by his daughter Sarah's death, and this is something which is reinforced by the 20-year time jump. Joel wears the watch Sarah gave to him even after it became broken, and it's clear that he has not forgotten the reason that she died. We see Joel acting on guard when he infiltrates Robert's complex with Tess, and through the apprehension and distrust that she and him both express throughout the game. One of the clearest examples of this is when Joel comes across an ambush in Pittsburgh. Joel sees right through the bait and recognizes the trap.
Easy!
Please!
Holy shit! Help! Are we gonna help him?
Put your seatbelt on, Ellie.
Well, what about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
Later on, we learn through dialogue between Joel and Ellie that Joel's past is by no means altruistic.
How did you know?
Know what?
About the ambush.
I've been on both sides.
Oh. So, you kill a lot of innocent people? I'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
Joel's history following the death of his daughter is alluded to as being rather dark and even villainous. This is supported by the falling out that Joel had with Tommy after Sarah's death. And even when Ellie begins to chip away at how emotionally isolated Joel is, he remains vigilant and relentless whenever he's faced with danger. These two elements from the sequel, however, directly clash with what's been established about Joel's character in the first game. Joel and Tommy both have histories with the Fireflies as well as countless other factions, yet they are completely nonchalant and don't even suspect a trap until it's sprung. These two particular elements are why this death scene is fundamentally flawed. It is set up using contrived story elements in order to put the antagonist and protagonist in the same room, and it is informed by actions that directly contradict Joel and Tommy's established character traits. Before concluding this point, I'd like to address one of the most common counter-arguments to this criticism, this being that Joel was acting out of character with how he was established in The Last of Us, but that it makes sense since Joel has become softened due to his time living in Jackson.
And people surprise us, right? People change, people evolve, people all the time. So it's like when the Joel that you see in the beginning of Last of Us Part 2, I mean, after the opening guitar scene, it's like that's 4 years of having lived in this community that's safe. 4 years of like, they meet people on the outside all the time and they bring them in. We have all these notes and stuff that they trust them.
I've addressed this concept of character development being overlooked by way of a time jump in a previous video. But when you have a fundamental trait about a character established in a story, it takes meticulous development to completely alter that trait. If, for instance, you have a character who is established to always check their pistol before a fight, and they lose to the protagonist by virtue of not checking their pistol, this would be a clear example of them acting out of character. In order for a scene like this to occur coherently, there needs to be establishment of a flaw in the character such as arrogance, recklessness, or blind trust. And to change these kinds of foundational character traits, it requires careful development for the character. This is something which is very difficult to do in a short amount of time. Simply jumping ahead in time and saying this character isn't hopeful anymore, or this character has grown soft, relies on the audience to fill in the gaps in the character development themselves, which is lazy writing in its purest form. And while flashbacks can assist in this regard, you need to be methodical to establish what traits have been changed without rushing to a payoff or not planning any setup. And in the case of Joel, the flashbacks with his character in The Last of Us Part 2 do not depict that he has grown soft at all. In fact, several of his actions show that he has remained cautious in spite of his and Ellie's improved living situation.
Ellie, here. I think I see a way through, but we got spores. Put your mask on.
Do I have to? It's just us.
What if we run into someone?
Okay, fine.
You gotta be smart about this. You stop wearing that mask, kiddo, and eventually you're gonna slip up in front of someone you shouldn't.
I've never slipped.
You ain't told nobody new, have you? Not Jesse or Dina or...
Of course not.
Okay, good.
This moment re-establishes that Joel is still cautious about potential danger even from the people he and Ellie are closest to. Ellie's immunity has been kept a secret from the people living in Jackson, and even while he and Ellie are alone simply looking for guitar strings, Joel still instructs Ellie to use her mask in the event that anyone should see her and inadvertently learn about her immunity. The same principle applies to Tommy's character. Many have propagated that because he is allowing people into Jackson, this demonstrates that he has become someone who blindly trusts others. Many different characters and stories have held this character trait of blindly trusting others to the point that it acts against them. And this can be quite effective depending on execution. While less screen time in the first game is dedicated to Tommy, there are several references to demonstrate that he is not someone who blindly trusts others. He and Maria holding Ellie and Joel at gunpoint at the gate to the dam, Tommy and Joel fighting off the hunters, and Joel and Tommy's conversation about Ellie all act against the idea that he blindly trusts others. And considering that The Last of Us Part 2 confirms that Tommy's former Firefly crew knows about Jackson, and that Joel informed Tommy about his actions at the end of the first game, it's ridiculous to believe that Tommy and Joel would fail to take any precautions considering the sheer volume of enemies they've made over the years. If the game is attempting to establish that Joel has grown soft, or that Tommy blindly trusts others, then there are several scenes that directly contradict this in the flashbacks of their characters, as well as the previous game, leaving the audience to assume that Joel and Tommy's core character traits have remained intact, only for this to be directly contradicted by Joel's death scene. And finally, I'd like to address arguments that have been made against Joel's status as a beloved character. Many who have defended The Last of Us Part 2 have felt the need to defame Joel as a character and argue against the connection many players shared with him.
In this game, we're constantly re-examining how we feel about Ellie. We understand her anger, but she's avenging someone who single-handedly did more damage to this world than anyone possibly could. Literally every death that happens after the first game is Joel's fault.
I had people in my chat saying that his death was unfair because they brutally murdered, and I quote, a beloved character. Joel is not a fucking beloved character. Winnie the Pooh is a beloved character. Joel is a violent anti-hero.
I caught zero logic in all that. And that last bit, pure gibberish.
Being a beloved character has nothing to do with being lovable or not being violent. The definition of beloved is much loved, and the reasoning for why an audience loves a character is redundant and often not based on how altruistic they are. That's why antagonistic characters like Annie Wilkes, Hannibal Lecter, and the Joker can be considered beloved characters in spite of their actions often being condemnable or evil. The perfect example of a beloved character that fits the mold that Cosmonaut just argued against is the Hound from Game of Thrones. The Hound is violent, vulgar, belligerent to nearly everyone he interacts with, and for the most part acts selfishly rather than selflessly. So with all these negative character traits, why is it that audiences tend to empathize with his character far more than his counterpart sibling, the Mountain? Well, it's the moments with his character where he demonstrates selflessness and even chivalry. Moments such as him saving Sansa from being raped, trying to bring Arya to safety, and him fighting the White Walkers are all moments where an audience can see humanity within the Hound and illustrate that there is hope for him despite his behavior and outward appearance. Obviously, a character doesn't necessarily need to possess redeemable traits in order to gain empathy from an audience, but it certainly can be effective, particularly when writing an anti-hero. The same logic applies to Joel. In the first game, Joel is shown murdering men en masse to save his life or protect his interest, and there are several scenes where he chooses to look the other way when he could save others instead. As a player, it is seeing his history, the characters he interacts with, and the difficult choices that he makes that create empathy for his character. Regardless of the actions that Joel took in the first game, or what people think about those decisions, Joel is a character that several players formed a connection with and is absolutely a beloved character. The death of a beloved character is something which often facilitates significant payoffs in the story, and the more consistent the progression of events and character work which led to these deaths are, the more effective the payoff will be. In the case of Joel, however, the scene in question relies on multiple contrivances and has two actions of beloved characters that go directly against their established traits. Tommy and Joel are both established to be cautious characters who survived for 20 years in the apocalypse because they were strategic and never let their guard down with strangers or enemies. Yet Joel's death spits in the face of what was established in the previous game by having them carelessly walk into a trap and surrendering their names, leaving this death inconsistent in regards to storytelling when it could have been immensely powerful. This death acts as the inciting incident of the game's story and informs the motivation of the protagonist, and unfortunately, these foundational storytelling elements rely on a broken origin. The last storytelling element I want to address is the game's ending. The game's narrative follows Ellie after directly witnessing Joel's torture and murder. Following this, she travels to Seattle and kills several of the Washington Liberation Front members who helped Abby murder Joel. But after Abby confronts and nearly kills Ellie, and one of the worst time jumps in fiction, Ellie is informed by Tommy about a lead on Abby. Ellie pursues Abby to Santa Barbara, where after fighting her way through the Rattlers, Ellie finds Abby and eventually engages her in a second fight. However, as she is about to drown Abby, Ellie has a flashback to Joel and inexplicably opts to let her go, leaving the game as a revenge story without its lead character taking the revenge. This decision obviously led to quite a bit of controversy among critics of the game, and as was the case with the previous point, I want to first address the straw man argument that many insist on using, this being that people dislike the ending of the game based on the isolated fact that Ellie spared Abby's life.
But people are mad. They're mad because you don't kill Abby and get revenge in the end, and I cannot understand that at all. If you got to this scene and you thought that the best narrative choice is for Ellie to kill Abby, then I truly cannot fathom how you consume stories.
In order for this argument to hold water, it would mean that a revenge story needs to conclude with the main character in question getting the revenge in order to be an effective story. But is this in fact the case? No. There are a plethora of stories which go directly against this. Some revenge stories end with the main character getting the revenge, some conclude with the villain winning over the hero, and some end in forgiveness or a peaceful conclusion rather than cold-blooded vengeance. The efficacy of these different ideas, as usual, comes down to execution. And in the case of The Last of Us Part 2, this ending is flawed for several different reasons. The primary issue regarding Ellie's decision is the simple lack of development for her conflict with Abby. The game begins by having Ellie be the character that the player controls, but following the reveal that Abby tracked Ellie down to the theater, the game switches to Abby's perspective during the time the player controlled Ellie. Likely because the writers wanted Abby's section of the game to alter player perspective, Ellie and Abby never interact or learn anything about each other. And even after Ellie tracks Abby down to the Rattler complex, they still do not share any substantive dialogue. Ellie still doesn't understand the real reason why Abby killed Joel, Abby doesn't understand the real reason why Joel killed her father, they don't learn anything about each other's histories, and they don't discuss their motivations. A large part of what drives revenge stories is the development between antagonist and protagonist. While a story may begin with the character going on a blind killing spree, this can only last for so long before it loses its narrative power. And if revenge is meant to be dispassionate, then it's best to not have the rivalry between antagonist and protagonist last throughout the narrative. The reason development for characters in this case is significant is that what Ellie has experienced and learned throughout the narrative is meant to influence her decision. And while the player has spent a significant amount of time from Abby's perspective, Ellie as a character knows nothing about Abby other than the fact that she killed Joel, Jesse, and nearly killed Tommy and Dina. What precedes Ellie sparing Abby's life is a memory Ellie has of Joel. We later learn that this memory was a conversation between Ellie and Joel and was in fact the last conversation they had with each other before his death. In this scene, Ellie tells Joel that she will try to find it in her heart to forgive him.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
I like that.
What many have taken from this scene is that since the flashback is about Ellie attempting to forgive Joel, Ellie is therefore finding it in her heart to forgive Abby.
And as Ellie is drowning Abby, she flashes to an image of Joel. Later, we see that she was actually flashing back to a very specific scene where Joel and her are talking about forgiveness. Ellie has to learn how to forgive Joel for what he did, and then she has to learn how to forgive Abby. So no, this is not a story about revenge. It is a story about forgiveness.
Right before Ellie is about to drown Abby in pure rage, she once again thinks of Joel as motivation, but it has the opposite effect. It reminds her of his humanity, which reminds her of her humanity. It's really well done.
The trouble, once again, comes from her motivations being unclear. If this is something which she did out of seeing Abby's suffering and therefore chooses to forgive her, then this opens up the conversation about ludonarrative dissonance. In gameplay, Ellie is a relentless killer who murders left and right and kills well over 100 people throughout the narrative. Contradictorily, in cutscenes, however, Ellie is shaken by the violence she commits. Therefore, after playing as Ellie throughout the game and killing countless people in her effort to kill a single person, it's ridiculous to think that Ellie wouldn't go through with her revenge out of guilt or squeamishness, regardless of what the cutscenes propagate. As for the forgiveness, Ellie has no character-based reasoning to let Abby live. And if it really is as simple as her choosing to let Abby live because of a conversation she had with Joel and nothing to do with what she's learned throughout the game, then that makes this moment narratively thin. So with all this considered, you may be asking yourself, what is an example of a revenge story concluding with an act of forgiveness done right? What's a story taking place in a post-apocalyptic setting, revolving around the death of someone close to the main character, following said character's relentless trek to hunt down their oppressor, and ending with the character forgiving their adversary rather than taking their vengeance? Ah yes, War for the Planet of the Apes tells the story of Caesar, a highly intelligent ape leading a colony of other apes in a war against the human military faction called Alpha Omega. The film's inciting incident occurs when Alpha Omega's leading colonel infiltrates Caesar's hidden cave and kills Caesar's wife and son. Following this, Caesar sends his people to a place thought to be a safe haven while he sets out on his own to kill the colonel. After tracking him to a quarantine facility, Caesar is captured by Alpha Omega and learns that his colony was also captured. In the film's third act, a military faction seeking to terminate the colonel's command storms the facility, leading to a battle, while Maurice and Rocket attempt to lead the colony to safety. In the chaos, Caesar finds the colonel intent on killing him, but after their confrontation, Caesar chooses not to take his vengeance. The film then concludes with Caesar leading his people to safety before he succumbs to a wound he received in the battle and passes on. The framework for this story mirrors that of The Last of Us Part 2 in a multitude of storytelling elements, including its plot points, characters, themes, and setting. So how is it that War for the Planet of the Apes succeeds with its story of revenge where The Last of Us Part 2 falls short? Well, from the start, the film's inciting incident relies far more on cause and effect rather than contrivance or bad luck. Caesar learns early on that the colonel found his colony after a traitor ape named Winter sold out the colony in exchange for his life. The film also provides solid situational reasoning for why neither Caesar nor the colonel were able to kill each other following the death of Caesar's family. But the key difference occurs around the halfway mark of War for the Planet of the Apes, where Caesar learns about the colonel's history. It's revealed that the colonel learned that the virus which nearly destroyed humanity has mutated in a way where infected humans are turning primitive and losing their ability to speak. The colonel has been killing his own men who've become infected, and his superiors are seeking to relieve him of his command.
10 months ago, I sent out recon units to look for your base. My own son was a soldier with one of the units. One day, he suddenly stopped speaking. Their medic had a theory, before he stopped speaking, that the virus that almost wiped us out had suddenly changed, and that if it spread, it would destroy humanity for good this time. I held that gun in my hand for a long time. I pointed it at my only child. Even in his primitive gaze, I felt his love. I pulled the trigger. It purified me. Made my purpose clear. I gave the orders to kill the other infected, all of them. Others with children deserted into the woods. One of those cowards fled to my superiors up north. If they wanted to relieve me of my command, they would have to meet me here and do it themselves. Look at you. You think I'm sick, don't you? I didn't mean to kill your son, but if his destiny was to inherit your unholy kingdom, I'm glad I did it. What do you think my men would have done to your apes if you'd killed me? Or is killing me more important?
This scene isn't meant to manipulate the audience into believing that the colonel is a good person. It's to provide Caesar with an understanding about the colonel's motivations. Beyond direct dialogue with the colonel, Caesar also is given challenging material from the apes who accompany Caesar on his journey. What's introduced early on in the form of nightmares is that Caesar fears that he is becoming like Koba, the ape who betrayed Caesar and served as the antagonist of the previous film. This is something that is directly addressed after the character Luca is killed by soldiers.
They must pay.
The internal conflict with Caesar comes from him being forced to choose either his people or revenge. One choice mirrors his former enemy, and the other is who Caesar is at heart. In the film's third act, after Caesar decides to go through with killing the colonel, he tells Rocket that Maurice was right and that he has become like Koba. And all of it culminates in this scene. Not a single word of dialogue spoken by either character. Yet the motivations and shifts in characters' attitudes is perfectly expressed solely through the actors and direction of the scene. Caesar begins the scene in utter rage, only to see that the Colonel has contracted the virus from touching the doll that Nova left in Caesar's cage. The Colonel now wishes for death and puts the gun to his own head, pulling back the hammer himself. Seeing the Colonel reduced to this isn't enough to satisfy Caesar's hate, and Caesar pushes the Colonel's hand away from the gun, intent on ending it on his own terms. But this moment is where Caesar rejects his earlier statement that he has become like Koba and chooses his people rather than revenge. Caesar then puts down the gun and offers the Colonel the dignity of taking his own life. Caesar knows that the Colonel refuses to live like a beast and will fall through with his principles just like he did with his son. It's a scene that pays off everything set up about the principles and motivations of these two characters. The main character of this revenge story does not claim the revenge, but in spite of that, this scene and Caesar's entire journey throughout War for the Planet of the Apes is immensely satisfying on a narrative level. The Colonel's God complex and the narrative similarities to Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now are handled with about as much subtlety as a sledgehammer to the face. But in regards to revenge dynamics between two characters, War for the Planet of the Apes succeeds extraordinarily well in developing its plot and characters consistently. As was previously addressed, the issue regarding the final fight between Ellie and Abby is the lack of setup for Ellie's decision. Ellie doesn't know Abby enough to justify her decision to spare Abby's life, leaving the audience to grasp at thinly developed themes such as forgiveness and humanity to make up for the lack of narrative setup for this payoff. Most revenge stories have simple premises. How a story executes its revenge is what defines the good stories from the bad. Regardless of if the writers decide to have the revenge story end in rage or mercy, the most important part is to establish clear motivations for the characters to avoid cognitive dissonance when the story reaches its payoffs. And in the case of The Last of Us Part 2, this fight and ending is not informed by quality development, motivations, or setup, leaving the scene underwhelming and narratively lacking. The Last of Us Part 2 is a story that has divided players very similarly to how The Last Jedi divided audience members. There is obviously far more to discuss about this game than the two subjects I have addressed, such as the game's pacing, dialogue, and use of time jumps. But in regards to these two elements in particular, the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is heavily flawed. The death scene of the main character of the first game relies on multiple contrivances and two characters acting against their core traits. And the conclusion of the game attempts to pay off a revenge story with forgiveness without providing sufficient development or setup. It's a story that has several interesting ideas that are very much worth exploring, but in delivery and execution, however, it largely falls flat.